everyone, and welcome to our second part of our three-part series on assessment and really making it meaningful for our students for K to 20. So that's both K to 12 as well as for our post-secondary. And tonight we have Steve Jordans once again, Professor of Psychology at U of T Scarborough campus, who will be here to share some incredible ideas, strategies, and tips on how you can make assessment a very meaningful space for your students. Thanks, Steve. Over to you.
Thank you, Katina. All right, fantastic. So this is the second in a set of three. I'm going to talk at the end about what the third one will be. I'll give you a sense. But again, just to give you a little bit of context about myself, I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. I also teach a lot of psychology courses at U of T, but also on Coursera.org, so these free online courses. And I'll just mention, by the way, some of the more recent ones are about understanding and managing anxiety during COVID. There's one just for the general public, and there's also one for police officers and another one for healthcare workers. So they're getting really good ratings and helping a lot of people. So I just want to mention those as well. Teaching wise, I think it's kind of important sometimes to understand my weird context, because it maybe explains some of the ways my mind goes in certain situations. So I like to teach very large classes, and to some extent, my most regular teaching gig is intro psych at University of Toronto Scarborough, and in that case, I teach, for example, this fall, 1,800 students. And even before the pandemic, we used a really hybrid presentation style where students could physically come to classes if they wished, or they could watch the classes online. So we made it available both ways. With such a large class, the challenge, of course, is to give the students a really deep, rich learning experience. And there's only so many levers you have in an 1,800 student class, and a big lever that I've found is the assessments that I give along the way. And so that's why I've really become an assessment nerd, I guess you'll say. And you will sense as I talk through things that I think a lot about doing things at scale, taking evidence-based practices and using them at scale. And often that means using technology. So near the end of this session, for example, I will show you a couple of technology solutions that incorporate the sorts of ideas I'll talk about, one of which is a homegrown from my lab, and another which is from another third-party vendor called Tophat. So let's jump into it. Let me just say, for those of you who missed the first one, just to kind of get how the series all goes, we're actually talking about this continuum people have discussed between three sorts of approaches to assessment. Assessment of learning, which is what I talked about last time. I'll give you some highlights in a moment. Assessment for learning, that will be our subject today. And then assessment as learning, which is what I'll be talking about in the last session. It's actually my favorite, so I've saved the best for the last. But this is my second favorite, the assessment for learning. Last week was kind of the thing we have to start with, I think, the good starting place. And that's in the traditional approach to assessment. So the traditional approach kind of views assessment as a measuring device. So the idea for assessment of learning is that students have gone through some educational experience. We've exposed them to some information. We've tried to do so in engaging ways. We've used all of our best teaching, tricks to really be, to create a great educational experience. And ultimately, we would like to know, okay, how much of that information stuck? How much do the students remember? And we will use assessments often to do that. They could be short answer assessments. They could be longer answer assessments. They might be multiple choice tests. And so multiple choice tests are used quite a bit, especially in larger class contexts, again, where I kind of live. And that's what we talked about a little bit last week. How can you make the most out of a multiple choice test when you're using it as an assessment instrument? And we talked about really two issues that interconnect. The first issue, alluded to in the second bullet point here, is how you construct the questions. And the important point being, the goal of any assessment is, as alluded to in that first point, to get at the learning and to measure the learning. That's what we want to measure. But if we're not careful, other things can sneak in. For example, if we write questions that are overly complex, And those sentences that have like 3 commas in them when no commas would do if it were rewritten in a more direct way. But some people use that sort of indirect structure or whatever. And when the writing is complex, that's very hard for ESL kinds of students, or really any student that's not really comfortable with the language. And so suddenly we're not just measuring what they learn, but we're measuring how well they can parse English sentences, their language skills. And we don't really want to be measuring their language skills. We want to measure their learning. So we talked about how do you construct questions that do that well. And I alluded a lot to the work of David DiBattista, who is a multiple choice expert. So we talked about that. The other thing that we talked about, though, is another important thing is what you actually ask, how you ask the questions. Do you just ask them to recall something almost exactly as they learned it? You know how students will repeat things over and over and over to their self in their head to try to commit it to memory. And if you ask them about it in a way that's close enough to what they repeated, they can repeat it. But did they really understand it? Did they really get the point, or did they just memorize the point? So there's something called Bloom's hierarchy, which talks about the different depths to which students can understand something. And you can ask questions in a way that tap different levels of Bloom's hierarchy. And so you can just get at rote memory, and sometimes you want to do that, right? So maybe students learn something like the variable manipulated in an experiment is called Jeez, I just lost my memory there for a second. The independent variable. Okay, and so they might get a question that says the independent variable is the variable in an experiment that was, and maybe the answer is manipulated, right? So we're asking sort of the same question, just turning it around a little bit. But what we could also do is describe to them an experiment that has all sorts of characteristics. And one of the things we mention is a variable that was manipulated, but we mention a bunch of other things too. And now we ask the student, what was the independent variable in that study? And now if they really understand it, they can take that knowledge and apply it to a new context and answer that question well. And so we pointed out that this is really important because you really want your best students, the ones who learned it best, to score best. You want the score to reflect their knowledge. And especially when we have an online assessments and sort of open book assessments and we don't have a lot of control over academic integrity, there's this notion of how quick can a student find an answer on Google. They can find memorization kind of answers pretty quick on Google. But when you're asking students to apply the information, that's not there. That's not on Google. They have to understand it. So this is a really important point if you still want your best students to be rewarded for being your best students, that you include some of these deeper levels. Okay, that is presented in much more detail in a previous recording. You can check that out. And we also have a document that goes along with that in case you want to create your own questions. I want to go past that now. And I want to suggest that traditional approach is all well and good. You can indeed use assessments as a measuring tool, but you're not really tapping their full potential when you do. And so to kind of give the sense of the potential, I like to say things like this. Engagement is the front door to learning, right? We have to engage the students' minds. If their minds are not engaged, they're not going to learn anything. We don't teach, right? We motivate them to learn. They teach themselves, or they're really in control of their own learning, but engagement is the key to it. Now, if you accept that, then the next point is this. As kind of presented in this image here, students are seldom more engaged than when they're doing an assessment. Right? They're plugged in, they marks are on the line, they're thinking about the questions carefully. We have their mind when they're doing an assessment. Therefore, what if we use these assessments as contexts for learning? If they're maximally engaged, then that might be a great time to do some learning and within the assessment. Now, it turns out that sounds like a simple idea, but there's some research on this that suggests it's more powerful than it even sounds from this context. So this is a relatively famous research study. And when it comes to sort of evidence-based things in education, there's not much more evidence-based than something called the testing effect. And that's what I'm showing you here. And some of the biggest names in psychology, from Sternberg to Roediger, two cognitive psychologists that have very good reputations. They became very interested in educational psychology, and this is what they studied. So there's a lot of great papers on this. Let me describe to you this specific approach, and we'll go from there. Okay, so I'm going to have to kind of walk you through the data a little bit here because it's a little complex. So we'll start over here. Well, let's just start with it. Let's just start with the title and read what it says. So researchers asked college students to study a short science text using one of 4 methods and then tested them a week later. Okay, so let's look at these 4 methods. This is sort of classic. Students were given some time to study the material. So they sat down, they had one study session. And when they did that, then when we brought them back a while later, a week later, they were at about 28%, maybe 27% correct. Let's skip concept mapping for now, although I love concept mapping, but I'll come back to that now. Let's go to repeated study. If they got 2 study sessions, if you allowed them a second study session to study again, that enhanced their performance. They now went up to about 45%. Okay, so that helped them remember more. But if you, in fact, had them do a study session followed by a test, as instead of that second study, they actually test themselves, or they get a test, I should say, on what they just studied. So really, they've only had one study session followed by a test, but those students do better than, these guys, in this study they had two study sessions. There's another data set where they just had one, so I just saw that up there. So they had 2 study sessions as well, but then they did a test, okay? And then they came back a week later and got the real test. And when that happened, they're up to well over 60%. So this retrieval practice, we're going to come back to that. Doing a test after just learning something does something. And what does it do? Okay, often when we think about students learning, we focus on encoding. If we think in a memory sense, and encoding is trying to get the information into your mind. And there's no doubt that encoding is important. In fact, this distinction you're seeing here between one study session and concept mapping reflects that. So what is concept mapping? It's sometimes called mind mapping as well. The idea is, okay, the student studies. While they study, they write down the terms that they're encountering, maybe these new terms that they've never encountered, and they just write them down on a page. But then at the end of studying, they consider those concepts in pairs. And they think about how similar are those two things? Are they related in any way, or are they completely unrelated concepts? And they do the same thing with every pair. And they end up connecting the ones that are related with dark lines if they're really related, light lines if they're a little related. The point of all this is that they're thinking about it really deeply. And that is certainly helping their performance. Katina, did you want to jump in there? No.
I actually just wanted to let you know that Mafusa is back to join us.
Oh, excellent. Welcome. Cool. Mafusa, I'll just say I did a recap. I started mostly with a recap of what we did last week, which is great. And I was just getting into this next step. So I'll just back up just a little bit, just to kind of bring you along. I don't know when you joined, but
I just joined. So sorry.
What's that?
I just joined. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's perfectly fine. We were spinning our wheels a little bit too, so that's all good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so just to sort of bring you up, this was what we did last week. So just talking about using assessment tools to assess how much students learned. But now I'm going on to this other notion, which is called assessment for learning. And the basic concept here is that students are really engaged when they're being assessed. When they're doing some form of assessment, their mind is fully there. And so that seems like a great opportunity to do some learning. And I was just showing this data that suggests that sure enough, that seems to be true, but it's maybe even more powerful than we realized. So what we're looking at here, and you can kind of get the sense from the title, is that students came in and they were given this short science text to learn. So they either just got one session to read it, and if they just got one session and you brought them back a week later, they were something like 27 or 28% that they could remember. If you gave them 2 sessions to study, they did a little better. But this is the kind of important part, the retrieval practice. If you give them 2 sessions to study and then you test them, so this isn't the final test that they're going to get in a week. This is right after they study. They've just studied, and now they get a multiple choice test assessment on what they just studied. And that's it. But having that test somehow brings them from 40-some% to well over 60% retention a week later. That test is doing something. And as you see, we're going to emphasize something called retrieval practice. So just as you came in, I was just making the point that often when we think about learning as educators, we really focus on the first important step of learning, which we call encoding, getting the information into the student's mind. And there's no doubt that if we can help them with encoding, they're going to remember it better. And so the difference we're seeing here is between one study session or one study session with concept mapping afterwards. What's concept mapping? Again, very quickly, it's just as a student reads the text, every new term or whatever they think is important, they write a little note about it or just have a word to represent it. And then once they've read the whole text, they consider those concepts in pairs. And they kind of ask themselves the question, how are these things related and in what way are they related? Or maybe they're not related at all. And they start drawing lines between the concepts that they think are related, and they end up with this sort of map of the concept of all these lines. The important thing there is while they're doing that, they're thinking deeply about the items and how they're connected. And that's helping them get that sort of understanding level that we talked about last week. So instead of just memorizing now, they're really thinking deeply about the concepts. And there's no doubt that that is beneficial. That helps them quite a bit. But it's still not as good as this 2 sessions with retrieval practice. What this part highlights is that, yes, it's important to get the information in, and students need to work hard to do that. But it's also very valuable for them to practice getting the information out of their mind. So it's not just about getting it in, it's also getting it out. The more practice they get actually finding that right information and retrieving it, the better they actually will ultimately recall it. And so this has become a big issue. This general thing is called the testing effect, and I mentioned there's a whole lot of research on this, and it really has pointed out this importance of retrieval practice. One of the things you see here too is these are the direct questions. This is almost like that distinction I talked about things that are memorized or lower on Bloom's hierarchy versus really trying to test understanding. So can they draw inferences from what they learned? And what you see is this retrieval practice effect holds up there too. So does the encoding effect, by the way. With the concept maps, they have that much better understanding. Concept maps are a really good thing to do with your students. If you're not using concept maps or mind maps yet, I highly recommend them. But so too do I recommend retrieval practice. So let's talk about this a little bit. So people have gotten really excited about retrieval practice, and there's started to be this notion of having as much assessment as you can, as often as you can. That these tests, quizzes, they promote retrieval. They give students that retrieval practice, and that has been linked to improved memory retention and recall. I've shown you that students feel more confident in their knowledge because they understand things better, right? They reduced exam nerves because they're quite comfortable with the assessment context now. If this is a big part of their learning, if they run into assessments all the time, assessments stop freaking them out. Enhanced memory during stressful situations. I have no idea what that one means. Helps you identify what you do and don't know. More effective revision. Okay, I would focus probably on the top 3, especially, of course, the number 1. And this has been shown now over and over again. So this is the critical point of retrieval practice, that the regular use of low stakes assessment. So this is one of the kind of keys to retrieval practice and to using it well. We often have created a situation where assessments are intimidating, scary, because often we only have a small number of them. At least in the university setting, it's not unusual for a course to have a midterm and a final and nothing else. Not my courses, I guarantee you that, but many other courses are like that. And so if a student only has 2 assessments, and the small one is worth 35% of their grade, then those things are intimidating. But if they have a lot of assessments that are worth not much, then it's not so intimidating. And as they get interacting with it, they start to find it's a really useful part of the learning process. Again, I'll show you a couple of really clear contexts of that. So yeah, give them these regular things. That gives them the practice they need to get to practice getting newly learned information out of their brain. And that tends to be almost as important as getting the information into the brain. And we just neglect it a lot, often. We don't think about it. There's this guy named James Lang. He's got a book called Small Teaching. It's a relatively small book. What he means by small teaching is he's connecting to this notion from baseball, which they call small ball, where they talk about teams that do the little things, but they do them consistently. So stealing bases well, or bunting, or whatever. If you're into baseball, you know what small ball is. If you're not, you don't care. So the point he's trying to make is there are some things you can do in your educational practice, little tweaks, that make a big difference. And his book highlights those, and a lot of it, a whole chapter of it, is based on retrieval practice. He talks about a number of different ways you can weave this into your teaching, right from like students come to class Monday morning, and you want to start things off sometimes with an assessment, especially if they were supposed to do some reading over the weekend. Hey, welcome class, welcome back. Let's do this quick little quiz to see how you guys are doing. And that again gets their head warmed up, gets them practiced retrieving that. Of course, it also encourages them to read it, right? If this is happening regular. He also suggests things like little assessments right at the end of every teaching session to kind of get at what you just went over, and allow students to see if they can retrieve that information from their mind. So a really good book if you want to think of different ways or hear about different ways you can incorporate this into your teaching. Me, I'm a big class kind of guy. I'm a tech kind of guy. So I want to show you guys a couple of other examples, just to give you a sense of how this can scale up. And what it looks like when it does. And I think to some extent, this will be the future of assessment, or this will be one part of the future of assessment. It's actually part of the present of assessment, as you'll see. So first example I want to give you is from an edtech company called Tophat. They're a Canadian edtech company. They originally created sort of phone versions of clicker devices. I don't think you guys need to use those at all in high school, but let's just talk about them for a moment, because they're kind of cool too. They are I use 11 different technologies in my class, by the way. So there's a lot of tech going on. And one of them is the Tophat response system. The other one's the Tophat textbook, as you'll see in a moment. The response system, it allows me to do a couple things. So one of them is, the students all use their phones. I see some chat stuff going on, so I'm going to open that. What the heck? Yeah, excellent. There will be a recording. Absolutely. So the students open their phones. They have a little app on their phones, and when I'm presenting my lecture, they can see their slides on the phone or device if they want. But more important than that, there is a back channel where they can anonymously ask questions or upvote the questions that other students have asked. It's anonymous to each other. They don't see each other's names, so they can feel quite safe posting their thoughts or posting dumb questions, that they might think are dumb questions. And so they go ahead and use that. And in my teaching, I lecture, and then every now and then I take a break, grab my coffee, have a sip, pull out my phone, and look at their questions. And for me, it's ordered by most liked. So I can see right at the top of the list, what is the question that most students agree is an important question for me to answer. And so every now and then I answer those questions. In addition, you guys know polls like in Zoom and stuff like that. It has sort of polls on steroids where I can like present pictures and they can touch places on the pictures and it creates heat maps and stuff like that. But it allows me to ask questions of them. What do you guys think? They can answer, and it aggregates the data and presents it to all of us in the background. So I'll just mention that as a completely different, really nothing to do with assessment, but a lot to do with engagement and turning a lecture into a conversation, so to speak, kind of like how we use the chat to do that now. So I've always liked that response system approach. But then Tophat started, much to the chagrin of a lot of publishers, they started creating their own textbooks and offering them at a much lower price to students in a much more modern way, with a lot of evidence-based stuff stuck into them. So let me show you what that looks like. Come on now. There we go. Okay, so this is my Tophat account. And what you're seeing here is essentially a textbook. Let me just close that to neaten it up a little bit. Starting here anyway, we have a textbook. And it's just kind of cut up the way it is because I teach 1 through 9 in my part, and my colleague then jumps and teaches the rest of these. So these are the ones my students have to know. For any one of these chapters, they have what at first looks like a textbook. And it is a textbook, except it's got a couple of different features. One is I, as the professor, can embed things directly in the textbook. And so my lectures during COVID have been micro-learning lectures in here. So for example, if I press play on this one, we'll get a sense of, so this is 22 minutes. This is a long one for me. Most of the lectures that I have in here are 10 minutes or less, 10 to 12, but 8 to 12 would be a better way to say it, and more on the 8 side than the 12 side. But the idea here is, before they even read a chapter, I can talk to my students. And notice, right after I talk to them, here's a question about what they just said. This is retrieval practice. You just heard some stuff. Do you know the answer to this? Because you should now. Okay, then they read a little bit, chunk away. Oh, question about what they just read. And another question about what they just read. This one's a fancier question, that includes graphics and stuff like that, but they have to answer that question, etc. And so now we have this mix of multimedia, first of all, which is, of course, a lot of students like video. And so I can implant, is that the right word? Embed a YouTube video if I want. If I see a great YouTube video I wanted, I could plant it right in there. Or I could record my own videos and put them in as I do. You would see more of my videos as we go along. And this is how I like to use it. I mean, just to give you a sense. So it's like, for me, it's like I'm reading the textbook with them. And then every now and then they've just read something and I have something to say about what they just read. So I'm not teaching them what they've already been taught by the textbook. It's more like a reading club where it's like, okay, you've just read about all this stuff. Where am I? I guess I give them a lot of the basics here before I start jumping in with my lectures. But they read a lot of this stuff, and then at some point, there I am. I come jumping in and say, okay, let's talk about, in this case, the limits of some of this stuff. So it's a more interactive kind of style. But the point I like to make about this is that it's really incorporating this testing effect in the sort of most granular way. As students read stuff and encounter stuff, they're continually assessed on it. This seemed at first to me like we were treating the students like children. Oh, I mean, they're children. We're all children, right? But treating them in the sense of like, duh, of course they know the answer to that. They just read it. I took a course like this. And when I took a course like this, I suddenly realized how much I liked these assessments. They were a great way for me to either confirm my knowledge. Oh yeah, I know the answer to that. That's cool. Or to realize I didn't understand what I just read. And so should I go on to another paragraph that's going to build on something I didn't understand? Or now that I realize I didn't understand, well, maybe I should go back and read that again and get it right. That's the kind of role this micro assessment is playing. Let me just stop for a second there. And any thoughts or reactions to the Tophat thing or questions that you would have about that?
So, I do have a quick question, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
In
Anytime.
terms, Top Hat, so I'm assuming it's a paid service, number one, and then your students have an account on it in addition to yourself, correct?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the way they do things, I think students, just to give you a sense, I don't know how much you know the university world. The university world's kind of weird. So typically, we would ask students to buy a textbook that often costs $125, $130, depending on the text.
I remember those days.
Yeah, and sometimes it's like one term that textbook does. In this case, this costs students about $65. They can pay $20 to get a loose leaf version of it that they can put in a binder that obviously doesn't have all the embedded stuff. But if they want a hard copy, they can do that. But that $65 is for 2 terms. As I implied here, I use it for the first half, and then my colleague uses it for the second half. And it covers that response approach as well as the textbook itself, and it has some nice features in the textbook too. I mean, I'm not associated with Tophat. I'm just promoting them because I do like them. One of the things they can do, I can't see this from my side. Can I look at the student rate this content? I can somehow, but at any rate, what students can do is if they just read something, say they read this section, and it confused them. They have no idea what the heck that was about. They can put a little note on this and direct it to the author. They can literally say, I found this really confusing. The author doesn't write them back. It's not a chat or anything. It's just sort of a one-way approach. But then I can do the same thing as an instructor. I can send notes. I can actually edit. I can just change it if I want, so I can make it how I want it and move it around. But the idea is it becomes more of a living textbook. And so the author is sitting back and students are saying, this part's confusing. And so she will then revise that part, clarify it, and push it. Me as a professor, I can choose to just don't let my textbook change all through the term, or go ahead and let it, every time she pushes it, reflect that push. So it's kind of an interesting, different approach to the textbook. I even have trouble calling it a textbook because it's so interactive. One of the things I'm pushing them to do too is allow us to collect data, like have points where students are asked to input data. And then summarize that data so that we can actually sort of do experiments in the textbook, which would be really cool.
Neat.
Yeah. But
That's very
it's absolutely paid for. I have no idea if they're anywhere near K-12 right now.
That'll be research on my end.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to find out. They are probably the most successful ed tech company in Toronto. At least they are in terms of investment landed. They're doing well. Yeah, but they're doing good stuff. So more power to them. That's great. Yeah. So that's one example of sort of making the most of assessment while the students are learning. I'm going to show you another example, and it's one we talked about last week. So I'll just put this up quick and then I'll bring it back down again. But it's MTuner, and this is that funny messaging I have to give of, this is a tool I used. We developed it. It works. It's perfectly fine. Sharing it is a little tricky because it requires a little bit of support, a little bit of help, and every time we share it with somebody, they want new features, which makes perfect sense. But next week you'll learn about my real baby, Peer Scholar. You heard about it already. That's out in the world, and that really is taking all the bandwidth we have to support people using that. And while I love MTuner, I really love Peer Scholar. So MTuner is kind of sitting on a shelf as a tech that I use and share with people who understand the limits of that sharing. But it's really cool at the same time. So let's kind of jump in and give you a better sense of that.
I was super excited. That's why I had to make sure that I was here today, because MTuner, I really want to see it.
Yeah, and we should talk about, I'm starting to think that maybe, we'll see how you convince me, but I'm wondering sometimes if maybe approaching a publisher or, I don't know, Dell, maybe with the right partner that could handle the business side of distributing and supporting, maybe we could get it off the ground. So that might be an approach rather than shelving it. It might be time to find somebody to work with, because the tech itself is pretty much set to go. Okay, so I'll just give you a sense. So I logged in here, and this is just showing me various courses that I'm using. And if I do I'll just jump into the fall 2020 course. These are different activities I have set up in this course. And there's a lot of flexibility over how I do that. But let me just start by just showing you. I almost have to remember I haven't used this since last fall. We haven't had an M-tuner yet this fall. So you may watch me kind of scrambling to use my own tech because it's been a while. But I'm going to hop into one of the quizzes. And one of the things you can do, you see what you're seeing here is just, and yes, this is my class. So this is that 1400. So this would have been after the students had went through this 40 question quiz. And so there's a little question authoring tool here. There's a scheduling thing. The reason you see some different schedules is for accessibility students who get additional time. We spoke about that a little bit last week, that the tech itself, once you have an accommodation for a student, so if a given student, for example, gets twice as long to do a given question, then you update the schedule for that student, you record that, and then every test you give them, that will automatically be applied. So there are different schedules related to that. This is just showing us some data about the test, but let me show you how it kind of unfolds for students, so you get the sense of how we're using retrieval practice. And some of the other things, yeah. So, okay, so let me jump in. So it begins with just this ominous, don't cheat, cheating's evil, etc. You must not share questions or answers, blah, 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 blah. And so you accept and start. Okay. And now it starts a question. Now there's a timer going here, a 2-minute timer in this case, because you can time the questions. But it always starts with this open-ended thing. And this is kind of a weird thing we tell students. I may time out here. That's okay if I do. A weird thing we tell students, you will not get any grades directly for answering this question correctly. But if you take the time to do it, you're going to give yourself that retrieval practice. And a lot of, there's data out there now that says if you do this retrieval practice before you see the multiple choice question, then you will get on average anywhere from 4% to 12% better on the exam just by doing this. But it's up to you. So I show them the data, I leave it to them. But it always starts with a question like this. So a researcher is interested in 2 different relationships. The first is between the number of hours spent studying and GPA. The second relationship is between the number of hours spent watching television and GPA. When the data from these 2 data sets are placed on separate scatter plots, the researcher notices that the data from the first relationship falls more close on the line of best fit compared to the second. What does this tell us about the difference between these 2 relationships of interest? So the right answer should be that the second has more variability. You often will not get this exactly right. And it's not important that you get this exactly right. What's important is that you try to think about that and say, okay, what's going on with this question? Multiple choice shuts down deep thought. It shuts down what we call recall. So what we're doing right now is called recall, trying to pull the information out. But as soon as we go to multiple choice, and I'll do the submit now, the brain starts to do recognition. So it starts to look for the answer that looks best, which one seems to fit. And so it's trying to recognize the right answer rather than pull it from your mind. And so we like to have that pull from your mind first. That's the real retrieval practice. Okay, now that you've done that, now you've got these things to go along with. And see, none of them reflect my answer, which is, of course. And I'm going to try to pick this one wrong on purpose. Once again, by the way, there's a clock going here. There's a 1.5 minutes. And the way this would work is if I get it right first try, I'm not exactly sure how I've got this set up, but I think if I get it right first try, I get 2 points. If I don't, I get a second try. That's what I'm going to model for you, and I get 1 point. If I still don't get it right, I get 0 points. But either way, I'm going to leave the question knowing what was right and why. So let me try to pick something wrong. So the first one has a positive relationship. That's true, but that shouldn't be the answer. So I'm going to pick this. That's true, but that isn't the answer to that question. So let me press submit. Wrong. So I get a big wrong. But then I get this, Module 2.5. And so this is using that Tophat textbook that I just showed you that's all arranged in modules. And so this tells them, go to Module 2.5 of your textbook. And you now see 5 minutes to scan that module. Something in that module is related to the question that we just asked you. Now, it doesn't mean that the answer is there, because again, this could be one of those Bloom's, so we're using the Bloom stuff in here too, right? So we're doing application questions. This was an application question. So you're not going to find the exact answer, but if you read that section again, it should help you. And so they go there. This is sort of discovery-based learning now. They get a chance to go there and find that answer. They come back to the question. Their previous answer was grayed out, and they say, okay, what's the right answer now? The way they've worded it, I'm thinking in terms of variability, they're thinking in terms of relationship. So that's certainly wrong, has a larger absolute value. So it would be, this is the right answer. So it doesn't matter if I show you me picking a right or wrong. At this point, I will pick the right. Correct. But notice this. Even here, it says, the correlation coefficient represents the strength of the relationship. Data points that fall closely on the line of best fits suggest a strong relationship between the variables. That's mostly true. I have a problem with this question right now, because how close they fit has more to do with variability than strength of the relationship. But anyway, that's okay. The point for this practice is that we're really weaving in a bunch of different things here. We have the retrieval practice at the beginning to get them warmed up. And then we understand that they're going to learn on this test. And if we allow them to choose a wrong answer, we talked about this a bit last week, if we allow them to choose a wrong answer and then go on, they may learn that wrong answer. And in fact, we've got data in our lab that says they do. If you ask them that question again, they persist in their wrong answer. So they're learning that wrong answer. We're trying to prevent that from happening by immediately saying wrong and then immediately trying to push them to a high probability right. So we give them the hint with the idea that, if they do that, if they go there, there's a good chance they can get it on the second go. And so they may end up just getting 1 point. That's where you see I just got half because I got it the second time. But I still got it, and that's cool. So I ended up knowing, okay, that was the right answer. And then we kind of hit that over the head with an explanation that just says, yep, that's the right answer. And we say it again in a different way. And then they go on to the next question. More about our sort of approach to this stuff too. They can give feedback. They can just continue and skip it. But if they didn't like the question for any reason, or they want to say, you know what, I thought that was a 1.5 question, they can go ahead. They can even say here, yes, there was an issue, content, 2 right answers. So they can do this on the fly, which is just interesting for me because I, as the exam creator, can be watching as they're going through the exam, and I can be seeing these things pop up. I can actually correct questions on the fly and then put them back in the list for the ones that said it was a problem. So I can correct it and put it back in the list and take it off from the first one. So I can, on the fly, kind of create a nicer test. Plus, they like being able to, this is more self-determination theory kind of stuff, but we're trying to empower the students and making them feel like they're not just victims of the assessment context, but participants in it. Yeah, and so you get the idea. And this is just another example where I would just say whatever, just to walk you through it again. Whatever, doesn't matter what I say there. Get answers, I'm not even going to read it, I'm just going to pick the wrong answer. No, I picked the right answer. Even when I pick the right answer, it tells me I'm right. And I can do this or not. I can just continue on if you want. Yeah, that was an important study, especially nowadays. Yeah. Okay. So any questions or thoughts on that?
I made the comment. Sorry.
Yeah.
I made the comment in the chat. Like we do need a platform like this in the K-12 space.
Cool.
Just the idea of like what you've been sharing with us, that our testing process is reaffirming incorrect knowledge, or in like they're learning the wrong things, or they're reinforcing in their neural networks the wrong answers.
Yeah.
So I wish there was a way we could support each other to make sure that this comes out to the K-12 market, because we don't, like, I don't know, Katina, have you seen anything like this where teachers could give this type of multiple choice question but allow students to kind of go back
Interact with it. I know.
Yeah.
It's wild. I've never seen this, Steve. You've been holding this a secret.
we have actually. I've been using it, and I had a bad I don't want to call it a bad experience. And by the way, I'm essentially done, as you'll see, Katina. I've just got a couple of slides, so mostly done. But there was a professor at Waterloo that loved this, and she's like, "Can I use it?" And sure. And so she used it. And then she's a physics professor, and they have a lot of demands. They want to show figures and all these graphs and all this functionality and stuff. And at some point, because Peer Scholar was just so draining, and I have 2 developers on Peer Scholar, and she wanted us to really change things and add to it, where it was such a bad experience just trying to, not being able to help her the way that we wanted to help her, that we ended up deciding to just shelve it. We made this free for everybody during the pandemic at first, and we was using it fine, but these requests started to make us feel the pinch. So I did kind of shelf it, and I have to say, Mufasi, that you single-handedly are getting me to think, oh, maybe I should be seeking out a partnership.
This is nice.
Yeah, and it's much sort of, I won't show you all the details, but everything you just saw is very configurable too. Like, how many chances they get, whether you give them a hint or not, whether you give them an explanation, do they have to do that first retrieval thing or not? How many chances they get, how many points they get, getting it right at different times. All of that is there. And there's also some academic integrity stuff, which we won't get into in detail, but it can tell, for example, if 4 students are using the same computer to do stuff, if they're just passing a laptop back and forth. Nothing that proves academic integrity, but we use this more as a way of looking at factors that might enhance integrity and using this value more experimentally to say, oh yeah, that worked. There's more integrity. So we use it for our own purposes, not to catch students, so to speak. But yeah, there's a lot of cool bells and whistles, and it's pretty much, it's well beyond what they call minimum viable product. It's a really strong product. It's just the support and getting it out there. So anyway, you've really kind of inspired me in that regard. So I'm gonna have to think about it, and heck, Katina, if you know if there's any interest, I would love to chat.
Well, I was just gonna mention that right now we're having conversations about rethinking assessments, and so the market, or the environment, I'd rather say, is ripe for a tool like this. Yeah, because we're asking teachers to I'm going to be talking to science ACLs next week and tell them, no, you need to rethink how assessments are done. Since I'm going to tell you, in our district, it came from the director's level that we aren't giving exams this year again. And so there's an uproar, as you can think, in terms of math and science teachers and curriculum leaders as to what do you mean. And so the discussions are happening now, and it would be so cool to get them to shift in terms of thinking how to use assessments, but also what can be done with it, and having a tool like this is amazing. Well, no pressure.
Happy to chat with anybody. Here's the funny thing, when I kind of lay out the sort of talk series. So last week we were just talking about assessment of learning. This week we talked about using the assessment context for learning. I actually think MTuner is the better business product in terms of a product that would be easy to sell.
Yeah.
However, next week, and this is a bit of a promo for next week. Yeah. Next week you get Peer Scholar, and when I connect these two, I think MTuner really fits the current context well and could be immediately kind of uptaken and used at scale very quickly. Peer Scholar is kind of like the iPhone. in a little way. It's kind of saying, first of all, as you'll see when we talk about it, it's saying, okay, content's important, and this assessment approach we'll use will help students learn content better, but it's really targeted at those 21st century skills, really targeted at enhancing critical thinking, creative thinking, communication, metacognition. And in my opinion, that's where education needs to go. It's a harder sell, because when I demo Peer Scholar for people, they love it, but it's different. Yeah, they're not used to it. I think it's more important. That's why we kind of pump our horses to it.
Yeah, but it is work. That's the thing, right? It's work for the kids, and it's unlearning and relearning how they've been doing assessment for some time. So
Absolutely.
So that'll be the thing next week. Hopefully we can convince you to come out. It's more fun when you're here, I have to say.
Hey, what do you mean? What do you mean?
More fun. I said more fun. I didn't say it wasn't fun or whatever. It's just more.
Oh my goodness.
Double the fun. Double the fun. But yeah, that's what I wanted to cover today. And there's my email address if you want to discuss anything. But I really appreciate, Mufasa, your thoughts and your ideas and your encouragement, because it does have me rethinking.